So you and we're about to go on a little adventure together. That adventure is going to span 118 years of Tudors, and it's going to be one generation at a time. How does that sound to you? I'll be your host this evening. My name is Christina. Thank you for joining us here at my Tudor era Tapestry. Wedding bells are ringing in the valley for 6-year-old Princess Madeleine of Valois. Not literally, because the wedding took place near Paris. Madeleine's Aunt Marguerite was getting married. Marguerite was going to be a queen. She was wedding the King of Navarre. Madeleine knew little about the King of Navarre, but she did know a few things. The King of Navarre was a grand war hero. He had been captured at the same time as her father had been captured, but somehow he had managed to escape, and no one quite knew how he had managed it. It was a secret. Madeleine wanted to ask him about his escape when she saw him next. Maybe he could assist her brothers in escaping. Francis and Henri were still being held in Spain. It had been nearly a year. She was sad for a moment, with worry for her brothers. She wished her Lord Father would find a way to bring them home. Madeleine knew he wanted them home. Francis was heir. Her father could not leave their heir to languish in Spain. He was losing valuable education time. Life in the valley with her aunt and sister was starting to feel like home. The royal nursery seemed like a distant memory. Lady Catherine Carey was living a typical privileged life in 1527. She lived with her parents, away from court, and lived a generally lovely life. She had a little brother named Henry, after the king. She wondered about court sometimes. She would hear her mother talking about her Aunt Anne. Lady Anne had caught the king's favor. She had been receiving gifts and rewards for infatuating the king so well. Cathy's mother seemed to know a lot about that life. Mary was worried for her sister. She seemed to think that nothing good could come from the love of a king. It did not even sound like, from her mother's stories, that the Queen or Princess Mary were benefiting from the king's love at all. Cathy did not think court sounded at all enjoyable. Princessin Anna von Jülich-Kleefberg felt time creeping up on her. Her older sister was married. She had been married just after turning 15. Anna was already 12 years old. Marriage was getting very near. Now that Sibylla was married, Anna's parents were shifting their focus on Anna. Anna's betrothed had recently been decided on. She would marry Francis, the eldest son of the Duke of Lorraine. Anna would be a duchess. Francis' father had struggled through the peasants' revolt. Lorraine had been hit hard, but the Duke had tried to stay loyal to Catholicism and his childhood friend, the King of France. He had sent his son to France to learn at the court of his namesake, King Francis. They were Catholic, but after the revolt, they needed more allies, and the German princes were appealing. Anna's father had not had many peasants revolt, if any. He would be a strong ally, and Anna was the thread holding that alliance together. At 12, Anna did not want to marry too soon, but her betrothed was only 9, so she felt like she had some time. She wondered about Francis, about what kind of husband he would make. He was Catholic, and Anna's mother liked that. He was living in France, outside the world she had experienced her whole life, and Anna liked how that felt. For the second time, Mary Brandon was playing mother of the bride to one of her stepdaughters. This time, it was Mary's turn to get married. Her new husband was William Stanley. He was a rising man at Henry's court and a good match for young Mary. William was the grandson of Thomas Stanley, the husband of Mary's lady grandmother. He came from a good family. He was a baron and would be able to provide for Mary and any children they may have. Anne was still angry about her match 2 years before. She seemed to really hate her husband. Now that Mary's stepdaughters were married, she could spend more time focusing on her own children. Frances was only 10, but the time would be here before she knew it. The offers for Frances' hand were likely to be more intense. Frances was the daughter of a Tudor princess. When she had turned 41, Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England, had felt very alone and devoid of any hope for the future of her marriage. 6 months later, things had somehow gotten worse. Henry had mistresses before. This one felt different. She was somehow more demanding than the previous mistresses. He wanted to make her happy, and he did not seem to care how that made him look. Henry had decided that he wanted a divorce, and he would be shameless until he received it. In May, Henry had sent Edward Fox and Stephen Gardiner to speak to the Pope on his behalf. They were to plead his case. The answer they got was not the answer they had hoped for. The Pope had just experienced the sacking of Rome earlier that year. Emperor Charles V had invaded Italy and taken control. The Pope was not able to make his own decisions. Luckily for Queen Catherine, the Emperor was her beloved nephew. She had been supportive of him his entire life. Henry had not been. The Emperor was on her side, so for now, the answer was no. King Henry VIII would not be allowed a divorce. A letter had been sent to Cardinal Wolsey on behalf of Edmund Howard and his destitute family. Lady Catherine Howard knew she was poor. There was not always coins for food or new clothing. There was definitely no money for dowries. Some of Kate's older siblings were married or adults off on their own. She was only 3 and had a lot of life left to be provided for. Edmund Howard had written to Wolsey and asked for financial assistance. He had been away for some time, hiding from his debtors. He was headed for debtor's prison if the cardinal did not agree to help. Edmund had a long life, and at 49, he had a long list of enemies and very few friends. He needed help from someone powerful, and his brother, the Duke, was unwilling to help. Joyce seemed to worry all of the time. Kate saw her mother, looking much older than her 47 years, fretting over looming debts that the family was drowning in. Kate wished she could help, but she was still too little. None of the adults that surrounded her seemed to be able to fix it either. Kate had heard rumors that her aunt, Anne Boleyn, was rising at court, and wondered if she could be a savior for the poor relations. She thought it must be very nice to live a life devoid of worry. She may like to be queen herself someday. In the summer of 1527, things were getting serious between Lady Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. Henry was still hot on the trail of Lady Anne. The entire relationship between her and the king had started because they were both bored and intrigued by the idea. Anne did not understand the power she wielded with her charm and wit. The king was in love. She liked the idea of having so much power over the king. He yearned for her, and he let it be known. Anne had thought his passions would have cooled by now, but instead, he was making plans for their future. Henry had inquired about getting an annulment from his wife, the queen. He would then be able to cohabitate with Anne if he wanted. And he did want. She had found the entire idea ridiculous. He was married, and his wife knew he was interested in Anne. Henry had heard that there had been movement on the disillusionment of his marriage. There was hope. Anne still thought that sounded ridiculous, but if the annulment were allowed, she liked the idea of being the next queen. That would teach Cardinal Wolsey not to meddle in affairs of the heart. Anne was very fond of the king. They would jest, play cards, go on hunts with the king's men. Her life was leisure time with Henry, and she loved it that way. He had forgotten about her sister completely. Queen Catherine would be upset about the annulment, but in time Anne believed she would come to understand that that was all for the best. The king needed an heir, and all Catherine was able to provide was a single surviving daughter. Anne was sure she could do what Catherine could not. Henry Percy was a part of Anne's past, but she still kept him at the edges of her mind. He was married now, and not even an option Anne would entertain. She had learned that his father had died, and he had succeeded his father as the Earl of Northumberland. Had Anne married him, she would be a countess. But instead it was Mary Talbot who was the countess. Anne had heard the marriage was a disaster. They seemed miserable together, from the rumors Anne heard from trusted confidants. She tried to put it out of her mind. She may be queen soon, and queens did not fret about past loves. The summer Lady Catherine Parr turned 15. She was also betrothed. Maud Parr had made a decision, and Cat would be married off next year, or maybe the year after. Cat's brother William had been married back in February. William was 13, and his bride Anne was only 9. They were young and seemingly only married now because of Anne's overambitious mother. They would not live together for some time. Cat's groom was to be Edward Burr. He was from one of the old families. Cat had been pestering the cooks for information about her new family. They did not know a lot, but they had heard rumors. Edward was about 4 years older than Cat. He would be about 19. That seemed reasonable to her. His father was not a baron, but his grandfather was. In time, the barony would go to her father-in-law, and then to her husband. Cat would be a baroness. The rumors were that her betrothed's grandfather was quite mad. He had been locked away for some time. Edward's father was running everything. The story did sound interesting to Cat, and she thought that maybe married life would be an adventure. As she made her return from Wales back to court, Princess Mary Tudor tried to soothe her nerves. She had enjoyed her time away and hoped that her father and mother would notice the progress she had made. She felt like a different person than when she had left. As the coach bounced along, Mary looked down at her hems and noticed they were looking short. She would need new gowns soon. Mary was 11, and a new betrothed was being floated. There were talks that Princess Mary would be betrothed to Prince Henri of France. He was the younger brother of her old betrothed, Prince Francis. It was strange. Mary remembered when she was young and had been betrothed to Prince Francis, back when she was going to be the Queen of France. Now she was potentially going to be betrothed to Prince Henri. She was just going to be the wife of despair. Mary was 11, but she had time because Henri was only 8. There was another problem with this arrangement. Prince Henri was captive in Spain. He was there with his brother, her old betrothed. Together they were captors of her latest betrothed, Emperor Charles V. Mary had met the emperor. He had been a kind man. She hoped that he was being kind to the 2 French princes. She was in no hurry to marry, but she did wish the issue would finally be settled. One-year-old Lady Dorothy Stafford was blissfully unaware of her family's reduced circumstances. In truth, the family had peaked long before she was born. If she had been older, she would have noticed the relics of their old life, things that had not been sold, sentimental items of little value. They whispered of a wealth lost to time. When she would see extended family, she would see differences that she could not understand. Dorothy's lady grandmother wore gowns of soft silk, and she always smelled of some far-off flowers. Dorothy could always count on her for a small gift or sweet. Dorothy's uncle, Reginald, had returned to the realm this year. He had been away on the continent. He had been studying with the church since he was a very young child. King Henry had granted him a deanery. He was in favor with the king, just like Dorothy's lady grandmother. He brought news of Rome back with him. Rome had been sacked by the Holy Roman Emperor. The entire realm had been scandalized by it. The Pope was under the control of the Emperor. King Henry had been seeking divorce from Queen Catherine. The Emperor was Queen Catherine's nephew. The Pope would never grant the king a divorce while being held by the Queen's nephew. As good and proper Tudor subjects, the family was deeply offended by the Emperor's latest actions. If anyone was paying attention, they would have seen the look on Countess Maggie's face, that she had great affection for the Queen, and was happy for this win. The last will and testament of William Willoughby was still unsettled. Baroness Catherine Willoughby was not to blame for all of this confusion. She was only 8 years old. The confusion was he said, she said. Kit's uncle, Christopher Willoughby, was accusing her mother, Maria Willoughby, of withholding documents that proved that he was entitled to various lands. Kit's mother had said she had done no such thing, but he could take it up with the king. The king was in charge of any disputes over the barony. He usually had people to take care of these things for him. He did not have the time to care for every noble dispute in the realm. The dispute was taking a long time to settle. Maria had visited and told Kit that her uncle was mistaken. That was why she had to be a royal ward. She needed protection from greedy English nobles. Kit was the rightful Baroness Willoughby, and she was entitled to all of her inheritance. The king would make sure the Willoughbys were taken care of, just as William would have wanted. She had done it. Lady Jane Seymour was arriving to serve at court. Her family had been rising for a while, and her mother had served Queen Catherine on occasion when extra ladies were needed. Jane had made no progress with William Dormer's mother. She still refused to allow him to ask for Jane's hand. At 19, Jane felt far behind her peers. She was feeling the time passing as she slowly turned into an old maid. Edward's wife, Catherine, was only a year older than Jane. She had been married several years and had delivered Jane's first nephew. They had named him John, after Jane's father. He was such a beautiful boy and made a great heir to the heir. Edward and Catherine did not seem happy with each other most times. With the addition of this new baby boy, that had changed. They both seemed happy, basking in the joy of this healthy heir. Some of the pressure was off. Jane's pressure was building. She needed to prove herself at this new court of the Queen. She would either prove to William Dormer's mother that she was worthy, or make such a name for herself that she would no longer need her approval. So far, the biggest problem she had encountered was what kind of headwear she would don. The Queen and several of her most loyal ladies wore the English-style gable hood, while several of the younger ladies wore French-style hoods. Jane wanted to fit in with the younger ladies, but she wanted to be loyal to the Queen more. She had made the difficult decision to wear the English style, like the Queen. Court life had been slowly getting more and more complicated. Lady Jane Boleyn was serving Queen Catherine at the pleasure of the king. Janie's sister-in-law was also serving Queen Catherine at the pleasure of the king. But it was different. King Henry paid special attention to Lady Anne. She had him completely captivated. King Henry was going as far as to request a divorce from the Pope. Of course, it had been done before. The Pope would occasionally grant powerful men divorces from their wives. Unfortunately for the king, his wife's nephew was more powerful than him. Anne was rising in the king's affections, and that meant the entire family was rising in the king's affections. That meant that as a collective, they were also losing the Queen's affection. This made Janie's working life very complicated. It was difficult to serve the Queen at the king's pleasure with the surname Boleyn. At times, Janie envied Gertrude. She had left court to have a baby. Janie would see her old bedmate even less now. She hoped to be with child soon, but she had very little alone time with George. In truth, he did not seem to love Janie or even like her most of the time. When they were together, they quarreled often. Maybe marriage would be easier when she had a family and was away from court, and George most of the time. It was strange to be back at court. Lady Margaret Pole had been up at Ludlow until recently. She had enjoyed quiet days with Princess Mary. Court had always been too loud for Maggie. There was no guile needed at Ludlow. She could relax. Maggie walked into the schoolroom where Mary was working with her tutor. She was still in charge of Princess Mary and her education. She would receive reports on the progress of Princess Mary's schooling and pass it on to her lady mother. Since arriving back home, Maggie had noticed the marked change between the king and the Queen. Maggie had noticed that they were visiting with their daughter separately. This had been normal in the past, but Maggie did not see them together often at all. The king had a new interest, Lady Anne Boleyn. She had done her best to distract Princess Mary from the obvious distress, oftentimes with a word game. She was so clever. Arthur had written about his third baby. They had named her Margaret, after her lady grandmother. Maggie was so proud of herself for having dug this family's reputation out of the mud it had sunk into. Things had not improved a great deal in France for the royal family. King Francis was still free, but his sons were still captive, and a release was nowhere in sight. Lady Marie of Guise was 12, and astute enough to hear the whispers of goings-on occasionally. There had been whispers that King Francis was not in a hurry to get his sons back. Prince Francis was the heir, and Prince Henri was the spare. But King Francis had a third and youngest son at home. Prince Charles was 5 years old, and the apple of his father's eye. With 3 sons, the king could afford to lose a couple. In news from home, Marie's mother had delivered another baby right on schedule. She had yet another brother named Louis. Marie mused about what it would be like to share a household with a newborn. She had done it once when she was 4. She did not remember a lot about the time, but she had a vague memory of newborn Francis, and it seemed to her that he had cried a lot. She wondered if 8 years later, baby Louis cried that much. Marie had received a letter from her Aunt Renee, Duchess of Lorraine. She had written about Marie's cousin Francis. Francis was 10 years old, and he had just been betrothed to a German princess by the name of Anna of Cleves. Marie was surprised her cousin was already betrothed at just 10 years old, but he was the future Duke of Lorraine, and preparedness was the key. Her Aunt Renee had mentioned in her letter that she was 12, and inquiries had been made on her behalf to secure a husband. Marie was not sure how long she had left with the sisters at the convent, and she was quite excited to find out who her aunt and uncle would find for her. Certainly, she hoped it would not be a German prince. Margaret Tudor, Dowager Queen of Scots, was happier than she had been in a long time. She had received word from Rome about her divorce. The Pope was going to grant it. Meg was a single woman. The annulment had been approved in March. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had sacked Rome. The message delivery system had been interrupted, and she had not received word until December. That man was a menace. The emperor was only 27 years old, and he would attack anything that moved. By this point in her life, Meg was most loyal to Scotland and France. She had been exchanging letters with John Stuart. He had been her largest nemesis when she had custody of her son. But that was Archibald now. John had decided to retire to France. He was suited to it. He was a wealth of information. She knew secrets about everyone. Meg would use those secrets to get her power back. In the meantime, she would make plans. Henry Stuart had been a loyal ally and a good friend. Lately, Meg had started to feel more for him. He had declared his intentions to her. If she was agreeable, he desired to marry her. It all made sense to Meg. She would marry for the 3rd time. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com. Slide into my DMs on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast, or join the party on Patreon, where we have extended episodes and bonus content.